So I call today A Divided Kingdom, and it's inspired by a question, quite a long one. Swedenborg says that Jesus is the head of heaven, and then there are 3 levels. I've been thinking of people who use religion and Jesus to hate their neighbour, if they will go to heaven or to hell. On the one side they love Jesus, but on the other they hate their neighbour. And Jesus, as far as I understand, is all about neighbourly love. If these people go to heaven and become, let's say, natural angels, will they, as natural angels, hate the spiritual and celestial angels who are more focused on neighbourly love? What about Jesus himself, when they find out that Jesus is on the side of neighbourly love? Isn't this a rebellion of the parts against the whole? Isn't this a divided kingdom? What's the gist of this? What's the essential kind of hub of it? What's the kernel here that we need to look at? And what I've chosen to focus on today is the idea of division. When is division appropriate and when is it inappropriate? Is there a kind of a line in the sand that we must draw between ourselves and other people? Now, Jesus talks about both love and division in the Bible. So I wanted to share a few passages with you on both of those because these can be difficult ideas to kind of hold together. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. And he goes even further in Matthew chapter 5. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. So Jesus' command is to love. But on the other hand, we have passages talking about division, and we heard of one of them earlier on this morning. Do you suppose that I came to give peace on earth? I tell you, not at all, but rather division. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. So how do we reconcile these passages about love and about division? There's a couple of others I want to share with you because I find these fascinating. So on the one hand, in Luke chapter 9, the Lord says, do not forbid him, for he who is not against us is on our side. A couple of chapters later on, Jesus says, he who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters. And these statements are almost the same, but they don't quite fit together. So is there value in division? Is there value in distinctions between one thing and another? First of all, I want to share the distinction of inner and outer. So we have an internal person and an external person. What is visible to everybody else on the outside, what is not visible to everybody else on the inside. And although they're quite distinct and separate from one another, they need to work together. Unless affection puts itself forth or flows out into acts, it is suffocated to such a degree, finally, that a person has no longer any regard for the neighbour, but only for himself. So the affection, what is within, must work itself out into the external. There must be that connection, cooperation between the two. There's another division, and that is between the will and the understanding, or between good, what receives good in our life, and what receives truth. Good unites on the one hand, so, loving feelings unite us, whereas truth tends to divide. Truth tends to make a distinction between one thing and another, and yet they work together. They must work together. If solely divine truth were the Lord's, no one could be saved. For truth condemns everyone to hell. But divine good, which is the essence of mercy, raises people up from hell towards heaven. So between good and truth, there's this sort of fundamental conflict in the way that they work, the way they see the world, and yet they must work together. There's another division that is made, and that is between good and evil. Now, these must be separated. And yet in our world, they are commonly intermingled and mixed up together. You know, you look out in the world and you see both good and bad. You look within yourself and you see both good and bad. You encounter other people and you see both good and bad. They are intermingled one with another, and yet ultimately they must be separated, because if they are not separated, we will never find peace. And this is the division that Jesus is bringing to the world. Do you suppose that I came to give peace on earth? I tell you, not at all, but rather division. For from now on, 5 in one house will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. This is the division between good and evil which must take place. So my question is, given that we have these things within us that must work together, and these things within us that must be separated, how do we separate one set of things and yet keep together others that must cooperate and work together? When Jesus talks about these divisions within the house is us. And if you think about us as an internal and an external, a will and an understanding, at any of these points we find what is good and what is evil, what is false and what is true, intermingled. And our job is to separate them whilst keeping the house together, the internal and the external, the will and the understanding. So that's within us. What about in our relationship with others? Is there a line in the sand we should make to divide ourselves from other people in any way? So let's think about other people's internals and externals. Should we separate ourselves from others based on their internals? The problem with that is we can't see their internals. We can't see what is going on in somebody's head. We can only see what they do in the outward world, their actions, their attitudes to us, their attitudes to others. Should we then separate ourselves from others on the basis of their externals? The problem with that is an external action, whatever it might be, can be motivated in a number of different ways. Someone might do something that we dislike, but they might do it with the best of intention. And we've no real way of knowing what that intention is. One motivation within us might stir many different types of externals. Some we agree with and we are familiar with, some we are not familiar with. You think about the desire for devotion and connection with the Lord. You look even just within the Christian church, how many different ways that is expressed. Are we to divide ourselves according to the externals? Oh, you do that, that's not me, so I'm going to leave you well alone. You know, Paul wrote the first epistle to the Corinthians. He said, "Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul?" He's talking about these divisions occurring within the church. So it seems to me we can't separate ourselves from others on the basis of either internals or externals. What about will and understanding? Do we separate ourselves from others on the basis of their will or their understanding? Well, again, the will, the desires, the motivations, we can't see those. We've got no way of telling what they truly are. What about their understanding, the way they see the world, their basic doctrine, their understanding of things? Do we separate ourselves on that basis? Well, no. Again, that can be tied back to many different motivations. I want to go back to these two statements. So in chapter 9 of Luke, Jesus makes this statement, "Do not forbid him, for he who is not against us is on our side." He's addressing the disciples. The disciples have found a person who is casting out demons in the Lord's name, and they forbid it. They say, "No, don't do that." And they go and tell the Lord about it. And the Lord's response is this, "Do not forbid him, for he who is not against us is on our side." The second statement, chapter 11, "He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters." Now that statement is made to the Pharisees. You see, the Pharisees, what they have done, they have already separated themselves from the Lord. And this is what's happening here, when he makes this point. He says, "He who is not with me is against me." They have already made the separation themselves. Now, I want to jump back into chapter 12 with this statement. "When you go with your adversary to the magistrate, make every effort along the way to settle with him, lest he drag you to the judge deliver you to the officer, and the officer throw you into prison." This is a story of reconciliation, of coming together. It only makes any sense if the adversary, spoken of here, is good. You think about it. If the adversary were evil, this story would not make sense, not in totality. It only makes sense if the adversary is good. You see, the process of judgment Jesus spoke of throughout the Gospels, you think about the harvest parables, you think about the sheep and the goats, you think about the wise and foolish virgins. All of these parables of judgment are about a separation which takes place. And this separation, this judgment, is when the nature of what is good and what is evil is made known. It is seen. The thing is that this separation takes place quite naturally. We actually don't need to do anything about it ourselves. Evil itself is separation. It is disunion. So we actually do not need to separate ourselves. Separation will happen because of the nature of evil. This is why the Lord tells this story. We are to be reconciled with the nature of good. Because if we are not reconciled with the nature of good, we are separated. And we don't have good to blame for it, we have ourselves to blame for it. So when we come to talking about other people, do we separate ourselves from others or not? I would say this. Aside from our own need to adhere to our own conscience, our own sense of what I am or am not prepared to do, and aside from our own need for self-protection or to protect our family or the relationships that are near and dear to us, there is no reason to separate ourselves from anyone. That separation will occur by virtue of the nature of evil. And indeed, there is actually much to be gained by seeking a union, by seeking connection, by seeking relationship. Because you can never be a force for good in the life of anyone if you're not in their life. Our desire ought to be for good, for connection. Let me share one more thing with you. It is the intent of divine providence that everything created, collectively and in every detail, should be this kind of whole. That is, and he's speaking of divine love and divine wisdom. And that if it is not, it should become one. The Lord's nature is to seek connection. And if we are to be the children of God, we are to seek, wherever possible, this connection.